Venezuela's president consolidates power. Nicolas Maduro says he's retaken control of the last state institution in opposition hands. So, does his opponent Juan Guaido have any legitimacy left? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. Many say Venezuela's parliamentary election was over before it even began. The opposition boycotted Sunday's vote, calling it a sham. President Nicolas Maduro says he's regained the National Assembly, the last institution controlled by his opponent, Juan Guaido. It's the latest setback for the opposition's aim to remove Maduro from office. Our Latin America editor, Neumann, reports.
It wasn't necessary to wait for the official election results to be announced to know the outcome, as a jubilant President Nicolas Maduro made amply clear.
We had the patience, the wisdom to wait for this hour, to wait for this day, to get rid of that nefarious National Assembly that the opposition used to bring the plague of sanctions onto Venezuela. Now with this vote, we will have justice.
Venezuela's mainstream opposition boycotted the Legislative Assembly poll, which they say lacked the minimum conditions of a fair and free election. The pro-government Supreme Court had taken over 3 of the 4 principal opposition parties, appointing new leaders who are accused of being pawns of Maduro. In addition, the court appointed a new electoral council, also loyal to the government. And there were no independent observers, only staunch supporters like former Bolivian President Evo Morales. Despite threats to withhold subsidized food boxes to those who didn't vote, the turnout was poor.
In this voting center in the Macuto district, there is normally a lot of people when there's an election. Today, what you have is a fraud in our country, which has been clearly rejected.
Maduro's foreign allies like Russia, China and Iran will likely applaud the elections, which could give their commercial agreements with Venezuela a stronger legal framework with which to circumvent US and European sanctions. But the United States, the EU and many Latin American countries say they won't recognize the new parliament. Maduro plans to ask the new assembly to appoint a special commission to try enemies of the state, especially opposition leader Juan Guaido. But that could bring on more international reprisals.
I think it would be better for Maduro to leave Guaido alone and play cat and mouse with him. Grab him by the tail and let him go. What will the world see? An opposition leader who once had 61% support and now has half of that and is losing more by the day.
Guaido has been recognized as Venezuela's interim president by more than 50 countries. But his legitimacy has rested on being the elected leader of the National Assembly. Come January, when the new legislature is sworn in, the opposition will lose the only state institution it controlled, destroying what critics regard as the last remnant of democracy in Venezuela. Neumann, Al Jazeera.
In 2019, Juan Guaido declared himself interim president, claiming Maduro's re-election the year before was illegitimate. As head of the National Assembly, Guaido said he had the constitutional right to lead. More than 50 nations, including the US and Venezuela's neighbours, recognise him as the legitimate leader. Guaido promised to remove Maduro, form a transitional government and organise free elections. But his powers were limited as Maduro remained in control of the military and the judiciary. Let's bring in our guests. Paul Dobson is an analyst and electoral systems specialist at VenezuelaAnalysis.com. He joins us from Merida in Venezuela. In New York, we have Vanessa Neumann, founder and CEO of the consultancy Asymmetrica. She recently resigned as the official representative for Juan Guaido to the United Kingdom and Ireland. And joining us from Washington, D.C., Eric Farnsworth, Vice President at the Council of the Americas and former Senior Advisor to White House Special Envoy for the Americas. A warm welcome to you all. I'd like to begin in Venezuela with Paul Dobson. Is Venezuela now a one-party state?
Not at all, Imran. Not at all, I think. Looking at the initial results of yesterday's elections, we can see that the ruling party and their allies, there are 8 parties which also backed their candidates, obviously won a majority in the National Assembly, but there are also important representations for the opposition. One bloc of the opposition won 18% of the vote, another bloc won 4% of the vote, and even the left-wing critics of the government, the Communist Party, won 3%. So there's a wide and diverse representation in the new National Assembly, which will start its rule on January 5th.
But will it have any real teeth?
Well, as with every parliament in the world, there is a majority party, there is a majority voice, which will obviously impose its agenda on the parliament. This is how democracy works. So we will expect that the ruling party will pass the majority of the laws that it wishes to present to the National Assembly. But there will be opposition voices within that parliament. How effective they will be or not will depend a lot on the capacity of the parliamentary legislators who have been elected.
Vanessa Neumann in New York. It's quite a rosy picture Paul Dobson's painting there. I think apparently things are okay.
No, I don't agree with him at all. Absolutely not. I mean, this was, first of all, the Maduro regime is illegitimate. Whatever it does is illegitimate. It has, first of all, it has, Maduro is not supposed to be in power because he had a farcical election in 2018. The entire creation of basically Juan Guaido stems out of the legitimate National Assembly that won the election in 2015. So everything that Maduro does is illegitimate, period. This meant no constitutional guarantees. There are no proper international observation. They co-opted the insignias of the main opposition parties. They paid for the so-called opposition. They had no free airtime. They blocked communications, and they threatened people with food, saying, if you don't vote, you don't eat. Any election where you have a party that threatens you with starvation without voting for the regime is anti-democratic. It's using food. It's actually part of one of the complaints of crimes against humanity is using food as a political weapon. So in this election, they committed a crime against humanity in this so-called election. And that's really all you need to know. And the participation was, despite the threats of starvation, was absolutely visible. It's around 20%, perhaps even lower.
Now, Paul, I was a little unfair to you by saying you painted a rosy picture there, but you were telling us what was going on. However, Vanessa paints quite a different picture. Is there any part of that you do agree with?
Well, let's just clarify the participation. According to the data released by the Independent National Electoral Council, is 31%. There are a host of independent international observers in the country who are verifying still the electoral process. They will be emitting a report within the next 48 hours on their conclusions. So I think the election in itself does in fact meet international requirements of transparency. One other element which Vanessa pointed out, which is erroneous, is that all of the candidates, with in fact the exception of the Communist Party candidates, but all of the opposition candidates had free airtime on national TV, on private and public media, and were able to present their proposals to the country, okay? There were 107 parties running. So I think we have to be very careful when we look at this election, and we shouldn't be base our conclusions on preformed prejudices or political analysis, trying to distort it to further our own personal political agenda.
But food was used as a weapon in this election. You can't deny that.
Some of the government spokesmen did indeed point out that there was a link, yes, and this is obviously has to be looked at. This has to be investigated, because this is, of course, not right in any sort of functioning democracy, without a doubt.
In in Washington, D.C., Eric Farnsworth, the US made a big deal of backing Guaido. Alarm bells must be ringing, surely.
Well, in some ways, yes. In some ways, no. I mean, this was a completely predetermined result. I mean, we could have said what the results would have been 3 months ago or so. The European Union refused even to send a delegation to observe, because they said that even the basic elements of free and fair elections could not be met, and this was months ago. So this so-called election yesterday met no standards of legitimacy, and because of that, there was massive abstention across the country. The United States knew that, anticipated it, expected it, so from that perspective, it was a rather ho-hum result. In the context, though, of going forward, it does consolidate the Maduro dictatorship. It does remove the last vestige of Venezuela's once vibrant, if imperfect, democracy. It does take away the last public space for legitimate opposition voices to be raised in a peaceful manner. So going forward, it's going to be more complicated in Venezuela, no question about it. And the question will be, how does the United States and the international community respond? We're now faced with a consolidated dictatorship, and will that change policies going forward, or will there still be an effort to try to make some sort of accommodation? I think that's a real question that's going to have to be asked.
The incoming administration to the US, Joe Biden, has got a challenge on his hands with Iran, with China, with Russia. I mean, how far up the agenda is Venezuela going to get for the US?
It's a really good question that you're asking, Imran, because, look, any new administration in the U.S. is going to be faced with a wide variety of challenges, and the Biden administration coming in is going to be faced with an even greater set of challenges than normal because they're simply not receiving the same level of cooperation from the outgoing Trump administration in terms of transition, in terms of building a smooth process to continue looking at some rather complicated issues going forward, and you mentioned several of them. Venezuela is, however, the worst humanitarian crisis in the modern history of the Western Hemisphere. Over 20% of Venezuela's population is now outside of the country as refugees. This is a situation that can't be ignored. The question will be, is there a policy that can really help address some of these issues, and that's what people have struggled to find. And it will be incumbent, I think, on the incoming administration to really work to try to find those solutions. I would say, however, that Washington is driven often by crisis, and therefore, if something happens, and we're not hoping or predicting or wanting this to occur, but if some crisis occurs in the Venezuelan context, that would push the issue up the agenda in Washington.
Now, if you were advising the Special Envoy for the Americas, the White House Special Envoy to the Americas, Eric, what would you be telling him or her right now?
Well, I would be telling him a couple things. The first is the humanitarian crisis has to be addressed by the international community. It's not our fault, but it is our problem because this is affecting neighbors. It's affecting the people of Venezuela, certainly. So we have to do better in terms of addressing humanitarian crisis, number one. Number two, we have to continue to work with the international community. This is not a U.S. issue. This is a Venezuela issue, and we have to make sure that that perspective is maintained by the international community, the allies, the friends, certainly the democracies in the Western Hemisphere. But then I also think that the work that the Organization of American States, OAS, has done is very important, very profound, showing that Venezuela has the de facto government regime has committed crimes against humanity, against its own citizens. That process really has to be worked at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. That process is going forward, but it is taking a long time, and my hope would be, for example, that the United States could help encourage a more rapid process along those lines. Sanctions, I believe, will be continued against individuals in Venezuela, and of course, then the question is there a negotiation process in the future? I guess you have to ask the question is, would a negotiation process do any good? Would the Maduro regime actually be willing to negotiate anything in particular? And that's something that I think that the incoming administration in the United States will also have to decide.
Vanessa in New York, if you had any advice for the incoming administration, what would it be? And would you like them to push Venezuela right to the top of the agenda?
Yes, absolutely. They would. I mean, I know that actually for the incoming Biden administration, Latin America is not top of the agenda. However, Venezuela is at the top of the Latin America agenda because of the crises, as Eric was saying. It is because it's the biggest humanitarian crisis. It also has two issues. One of the main supports for Maduro, touches upon two issues that are high on the agenda for the Biden administration, which is China and Russia. We can expect Biden to take a much stronger line against Russia than the Trump administration did. And China continues to be very high on the agenda. If you've read any of the white papers of many of the incoming people from the administration, they're all aligned and concerned about Chinese influence in the Western Hemisphere. I am not, I don't think that necessarily everything is nefarious, but it is certainly an influence point that we have seen in Venezuela, that China continued support helps keep Maduro there. more broadly, though, the Russia issue, Russia has very long-term plans to stay in Venezuela and to really dominate it and turn it into another Cuba that does pose very strategic threats against the United States. I believe that a lot of the incoming people in the Biden administration get that. There are a number of issues, though. I think the opportunity to work more collaboratively with the European Union presents an opportunity for the Biden administration. And they need to also go back to pushing things like anti-corruption and integrity. I personally would very much like to see them pursue a very aggressive and very coherent asset recovery program. A lot of what has happened with why Maduro remains in power and why he has people who's supposed to, keep him there is because of the illicit financial flows from Venezuela. Other than Russia, it is one of the biggest kleptocracies in history. And all of that money that has flowed out has flowed through other political parties, through foreign banks, through foreign countries. And there is no surprise then that those countries have been corrupted into supporting them. And they need to keep Maduro there because it is basically a washing machine for illicit financial flows. So by targeting that more broadly than just the sanctions, when really cutting off those channels is a way to disincentivize the increased support for Maduro. And
well,
to get him
let's
to
talk
step
about that,
down
Vanessa. I want to come to Paul Dobson on this. If the United States and its allies play hardball with Venezuela, that plays into Maduro's hands, right? He can just say, well, look, it's the Americans meddling once again in South American affairs.
Without a doubt, without a doubt. One of the major policy lines which helped the ruling party in Venezuela win yesterday's elections is, in fact, the US blockade against the country. The US blockade. The government have been running out this line for months on end, trying to explain away all of the problems in the country and put the blame exclusively at the door of the blockade. When we look at the problems in the country, obviously we can't talk about them without mentioning the blockade. The blockade is completely illegal, criminal, under international law, and also has been described as collective punishment. But we also have to look at other internal factors, which is something which the ruling party is not doing in Venezuela: corruption, mismanagement, brain drain, and everything else. But the US policy under the Trump administration certainly gave a very easy scapegoat to the Maduro government in terms of explaining away the ongoing economic problems in the country.
But now he's got a challenge on his hands. If he has consolidated power, which he has done, he's got a real challenge on his hands in order to be able to deliver for the Venezuelan people. And, if there are sanctions, if there is this blockade, he simply won't be able to do it, will he?
Without a doubt, without a doubt. One of the major lessons from yesterday's election is that there is cross-party disillusionment with political leadership, both in terms of the Chavista forces, but also the opposition forces. And this really has a lot to do with the fact that people are looking for solutions. People are well aware of the problems. People are well aware of the causes of the problems in Venezuela. There's mass consciousness about the illegal criminal blockade, which is coming out of Washington. But people now, understanding all of this, want solutions. And they're looking for solutions from any party, any grouping which will promise them to them. And it's really about time that we start seeing things change here on the ground and the quality of life improve for ordinary Venezuelans.
Vanessa, I see you shaking your head there.
Yes, I just wanted to add one comment. I wanted to be clear. What I was advocating was not actually more sanctions or more of the blockade, as Paul Dobson is labeling it. What I'm talking about is getting back the assets that were stolen, the things that belong to the Venezuelan people, the mismanagement, the money that flowed out through corruption, through illicit financial flows. So I'm not saying greater strangulation, but we know that at least $300 to $450 billion has been stolen from the Venezuelan people. That should be found, and that you can incentivize banks by giving them sort of a certain percentage of like almost a finder's fee and put it into a basket that becomes a trust, that becomes the basis of a future sovereign wealth fund, and give everybody who collaborates in giving back what is stolen from the Venezuelan people back to the future prosperity of Venezuela, a stake in that future prosperity. There are solutions that can be found, and I think that the illicit financial flow networks is a very good way to do it. I'm not talking about stopping the money to the Venezuelan people. Quite the opposite. I'm saying for what was stolen to be restored. I'm talking about addressing the kleptocracy. So, and in terms, that is a solution, and there are many other solutions that can be proposed. I do agree that we do need, a coalition that is also more representative, an opposition that looks like the people it purports to represent. Venezuela is a rainbow.
Sorry, Vanessa, we are running out of time.
I
would like to get to our other guests as well. Eric Farnsworth in DC. Look, sanctions are always not a great tool for governments. They often backfire, as in the case of Iran, for example, and the maximum pressure policy the US has held there. Is any of what Vanessa is saying make sense to you? Is it a good strategy?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, hundreds of billions of dollars have been stolen by the regime through illicit sales of oil, which is the patrimony of the country, through outright theft, through money laundering. But those, by definition, those asset flows are devilishly difficult to track down. And it's not to say that the international community hasn't been looking at those for a long time. But I want to take you back to one other point, and that is the issue of sanctions. Ideally, sanctions are not just to be used to punish. They're also to be used to provide leverage, to create conditions that the people in power will find difficult to sustain and therefore want to negotiate a peaceful resolution to a political crisis. There is no blockade on the country. Items are allowed in, items are allowed out. A blockade is not something that the United States has pursued. It has pursued sanctions on individuals, and it has, of course, sanctioned the energy sector as well. And the individuals have been sanctioned for theft, as Vanessa was saying, but also for things like drug trafficking, also for things like human rights abuses, things like that the entire the international community is behind. The other thing I think we have to mention is that the United States explicitly allows and encourages humanitarian assistance into Venezuela, and it's Maduro himself who refuses to accept it. 2 years ago, the international community tried to get humanitarian assistance into the country, and Maduro deployed thugs on the border of Colombia and Brazil to literally kill people to make sure that humanitarian assistance did not come into the country, and that was really the cause and the issue there. If he would allow in humanitarian assistance from independent bodies like the Red Cross, then in fact that would be something that would help the Venezuelan people immensely.
Paul Dobson, you were shaking your head at almost everything Eric Farnsworth just said.
Well, I think with all due respect, I think a little bit more attention needs to be paid to what's actually happening in Venezuela. Humanitarian aid has arrived many times over the last 2 years. It hasn't come from Washington, no, but there are other instances in the global community which provide humanitarian aid. Maybe for people in Washington, this is hard to imagine that there are other powers in the world, but yes, they do exist and they have sent humanitarian aid. Red Cross humanitarian aid, Chinese humanitarian aid, Latin American humanitarian aid, even from the Vatican, they've sent humanitarian aid, okay? So this has happened and the government are not blocking this, okay? And the other point I wanted to take issue with is the lie that the US is allowing things to come in and out of Venezuela. Only a few months ago, the US seized some oil tankers bringing fuel to Venezuela. They took this oil and then they sold it, and that money, I presume, is in the Federal Reserve, but it's certainly not here in Venezuela. So the US is not allowing things to come in and out of Venezuela. There are severe shortages of fuel in Venezuela, which, again, I repeat, have something to do with mismanagement of the industry, corruption, brain drain, a whole other range of issues, but principally because of the blockade, because the US is seizing fuel tankers bringing fuel to Venezuela.
But Paul, those fuel tankers came from Iran, and Iran is under sanctions
a few were allowed in, and then subsequently a few were seized.
But that's not a Venezuelan issue. That's actually America and Iran. Those tankers were illegal.
But it was fuel which was bought by Venezuela to distribute across the country for its population, and the US did not allow this fuel to arrive into the country. This is a fact.
Eric, what do you think?
The sector has been sanctioned. That's correct. The energy sector has been sanctioned, but under international sanctions. But there is no blockade on the country. Food and medicine and humanitarian assistance and other things are allowed into the country. The problem here is the collapse of governance coming from Caracas, the collapse of the economy instituted by Maduro and the folks around him, and the theft of the national patrimony that has been conducted for almost 20 years by the Chavista governments. This is the real problem. The international community is trying to find ways to address that in a way that's consistent with democratic practice and that does the most good for the most Venezuelan people, who at the end of the day are the real people who are the losers in this entire political battle.
I want to thank all our guests, Paul Dobson, Vanessa Neumann and Eric Farnsworth. And I want to thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.